via the internet, they might think that I was overflowing, in fact, in some things. But I don't know that they would think of me in these terms. And that Paul is writing to this group of Christians that they could achieve this state. And I felt the need to call attention to that, not just be self-depreciating, but that if indeed that's the fact that's the reason why this workbook author thought that the book was written, then this is the prize that we should have our eye on. This is what we should be thinking about and working toward as we take the time over the next quarter to open this book and to study it, consider from it. Before we get into the study proper, let's start with a word of prayer. Joe, would you use your outside voice and offer a prayer for us, please?
Almighty God, our Heavenly Father, we're so grateful, Lord, that you spared our lives for this hour to study of your word. We're grateful, Lord, for Mark and other teachers who have prepared lessons for our edification and for your glorification. We pray, Lord, that all that we do this morning will be your glory and honor and praise. In Jesus' name.
Okay. What can you tell me in your preparations about the church at Colossae? Is it famous? Is it something that it's known for, other than having a letter written to it? I'm going to take that one off the table. Not much. Did Paul ever visit them? Did Paul establish it? Well, he didn't visit them. That's a firm no. There's no record of it. Among the places that Paul visited in his missionary journeys, he visited the region that Colossae is considered a city of, but there's no record of him visiting. No record of him that I know of, even among traditions, that he ever visited there. Who, in fact, established this church, do you think? Epaphras is the one that's most likely mentioned and is mentioned here. And in fact, it appears that this is a group of letters that were dated in the late 50s, early 60s of a period of Paul's time that he was imprisoned. And this it's kind of a personal letter for some place he's never been before, I thought. Let's just say that they appear to know a lot of people, the same people. At least in some of the list of people that Paul cites at the end of the book, sending greetings to them. It's one of it is in fact in one of the books that is among the it's widely held by the first century Christian writers, not necessarily inspired writers, but people who were alive who were Christians in the first century whose writings survived to this time. That Luke is, of course, the author of the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles. Makes up those two books, by the way, make up about a quarter of the New Testament. So that's a significant contributor in terms of volume. But Luke never attributes himself in those letters. There is evidence, or at least 3 sections of the book, including the very closing of the book, in which Luke, the writer of the book of the Acts, of the Gospel of Acts, or the Acts of the Apostles, traveled with Paul to Rome, and traveled with him during a portion, particularly in his second missionary journeys, in a portion of his journeys in this part of the world. As a matter of fact, this part of Asia, or this part of middle part of the Roman Empire, but he's never really identified in his books by name. This is one of 3 mentions of Luke by name in the New Testament. Is among the common acquaintances between the church at Colossae and Paul in this book, and sending his greetings. The beloved physician Luke sends his greetings, and so it's this, whoever it was who wrote the book of Luke also wrote the book of Acts. I think we probably covered that in quite a bit of detail. And was a traveling companion of Paul, then we know now that Luke was one of those amongst those folks who were traveling companions. There's a companion book to Luke And that's or to Colossians, to that letter. Another even more personal letter to someone that Paul definitely knew personally, about a person that they had in common, a runaway slave, in Philemon. It's thought, as a matter of fact, that Philemon is from this part of the country. You may actually be, Philemon may have been a member of the church at Colossae. Don't know positively, but again, they know a lot of the same people. And the selection of greetings, the people that are sending greetings in both of those books overlap quite a bit, and probably were written in a similar part of time. Paul, in fact, announces his intent to visit Philemon, and thus, I believe, the church at Colossae, as a result, in the book of Philemon. And so despite the fact that Paul's never been there personally, there seems to be more than a casual connection. He's definitely taken an interest in what the problems that and the false teachings that the Colossians are facing, and enough to be able to write to them. And that writing may, in fact, be on Epaphras' behalf. Epaphras may have, it's been postulated, that Epaphras visited Paul in prison so that he could get an update. He could get the teachings that he needed to be able to take back to Colossae to combat the errors that they had. Now, Colossae is it's not a mean or a poor place or anything like that. It's a significant city that's about 120 miles inland in Asia from the coastline, about the same degrees, same latitude as the city of Ephesus. But Ephesus is much closer to the coast, and it's a much more prominent city by virtue of it being close to the coast. It's not an easy trip, although there was a direct route that the Persians built from Ephesus to Persia that ran right through Colossae. Colossae is also on a river. And generally, rivers were important places to build cities in the ancient world because they had access to things like water and transportation, and were generally attractive places to be able to build. Further north, if you follow the river north about 9 miles or so, you'll come to Laodicea. And that name should ring a bell. That's one that we do know something about, although we don't have a letter written to them. Well, we do. In the book of Revelations, they're mentioned specifically, although they're grouped in with 6 other churches in Asia, and this is some later period. And there's Hierapolis is also a significant city that's on the opposite side of the river than Laodicea, about the same 9 or 10 miles north of Colossae. They enjoyed quite a bit more prominence and prestige and riches and such. Colossae was maybe more like a mill town. Matter of fact, that there was a significant product in the first century that was developed that bore its name, colossinum, which was a type of wool that was processed. And so the surrounding areas, being a place in which you would gather, would be good for raising sheep. Then they would process that wool, and they thus had something of a namesake that really associated with them. So it's not a fabulous town. It's not a fantastic town. And there were towns that were quite a bit more prominent, but it enjoyed a certain level of prosperity because of the natural resources, the river and the access to the wool, and the fact that it was well placed in terms of this crossroads. That there was a road that ran from the Mediterranean up to Sardis and the coast that kind of ran, southeast to northwest, or northwest to southeast, depending on which direction you're going, that went right past this Persian highway where Colossae was situated. Tim's smiling because he knows how much I'm mangling geography. But nonetheless, this is this kind of setting for the church there. And the church, the tradition says, has been there for quite some time. It's largely thought to be of a mostly Gentile converts. Although some of the teachings that Paul will explain to them are particularly Jewish in nature. And in fact, Aristarchus, in about the 3rd century BC, dislocated a group of Jews. He established a Jewish colony at this place and transported them out of Palestine and other places in the Grecian Empire, or what was the post-Grecian Empire, into this part of the country, And so it very likely had it very evidently had a Jewish influence. Don't know, and tradition-wise, there's thought that it wasn't a strict Orthodox teaching of Judaism there, and in fact that the leader of the synagogue may have moonlit as a leader in one of the pagan temples at the same time. It just being pointed by the city leaders. You're the religious guy, and you'll spend Saturday here, and you'll spend these other days in the pagan temples. And so a lot of that is obviously extra biblical. This is obviously I'm belying the fact that I spent some time on Wikipedia and the internet and being able to plumb these things, because they're written about other people writing about other writings in the first century. So we're 2 or 3 degrees removed from actual facts about the city of Laodicea, of the cities of Laodicea, Hierapolis, and of Colossae. There were a number of different influences, though, that were associated with this city's establishment, probably again in about the 3rd century or so BC, up into this time, and it has kind of an abrupt end. Around AD 62, there was a devastating earthquake in this river valley, and this earthquake was particularly hard on Colossae. Colossae wasn't of the means of the 2 cities to the north, who were rebuilt largely without assistance from the government. Colossae was all kind of left to her own means, so that particular city wasn't as built. You can visit this part of the country. It's in southwest Turkey now. It's at the foot of a pretty prominent mountain. And again, it's situated on a river, and there are ruins that you can go there and visit if you're historically inclined, but probably not anything that you would recognize from the New Testament, because there's no action that we can read about in Colossae, no event that we can read about in the New Testament that you would go there to see and say, well, this must be where Paul ate his lunch, or this is where Paul preached to the synagogue. There's no evidence of any of that. So we're kind of unique in that we've got a book of a significant doctrine, important doctrine, that's been written by an important person, a significant spirit-inspired author to people we just don't know very much about. That's my pitch. Did you discover something else? Or did you get something from the lesson about the city of Colossae or about its people that stood out to you?
I didn't get anything about what you said, but I do think there's an element that he doesn't mention in here that I think is significant. And that is, it appears that the book of Colossians was meant to be a cyclical letter. And you see that because of the fact that in the 4th chapter, he tells them, read this letter to the church of Laodicea, the letter that was sent to the church of Laodicea, you read it.
Right.
So there was a letter written to the Laodiceans, it just
didn't survive. Yeah, and that's an important aspect of this too, and it's kind of meant as a tract of sorts. That it wouldn't be that the message is not so exclusive to the church at Colossae that it shouldn't be shared with others. And the intention was that I wrote to the Laodiceans too, make sure that you trade letters with them so that you get the benefit of the content of both letters. And so this is probably a significant part of Paul's plans when he was imprisoned in Rome, and not even though he intended to visit these and announced his intention to visit some of the recipients in person, don't know that he ever got that opportunity. But in the meantime, he intended to have these particular letters circulated. They weren't so personalized, and it didn't involve such a frequent exchange like with the letter of the Philippians or the letter of the Colossians, that there's particular issues or particular people and personalities that are being addressed in this particular book. I'll ask you, what's the centerpiece? What's this book focused on? Jesus. And I don't mean that in a casual way. That some people, that's kind of the joke is in the grade school classes. If I answered any question, it's Jesus or God. You kind of rotate between them, particularly if you don't know the answer. But this one is particularly focused on that. It's particularly emphasizing the fact that Jesus is all there is. Jesus is all there needs to be. The sufficiency of Jesus is going to be one of the points that Paul's going to be hammering home here, because there's some significant heresies that have begun to rise up. Now, Paul, he battled a lot of false religions. Idolatry was one of them, and the emphasis on idolatry in this part of the country is not a small one. This is an idol country. This is the, in a matter of fact, a very heartfelt worship of Zeus and worship of not so much the Greek pantheon, but the Roman collection of gods was rife. And there's even inscriptions and such on coins that have Egyptian symbolism on them. So it's thought that even here in Colossae, centuries after the Egyptians were a world empire, that in fact the Egyptians' religions, those idolatries continue to exist in the ancient world. And so there's a lot of different influences here, and a lot of competition potentially for things of saying why you need something else besides Jesus, or that Jesus guy is okay, but you really ought to look into worshiping Isis, because Isis can give you this, and that's the kind of competition I think that Paul is writing this letter to be able to combat. There was also this is also about the time in the first century in which Gnosticism and this kind of aesthetics. That word that was mentioned here in the preparatory lesson, aesthetic. Do you know what that means?
Nobody really agreed on it.
Okay. What did some of them? Was there any consensus?
Almost like legalism, just trying to be so good that you make up rules.
Okay, Joe. It was really lots of different lenses that you can look at aestheticism, but there's kind of a natural aestheticism in which you simplify your life. And you get rid of all the stuff that you don't have to survive, and you lead a simple life, but it's not one that's seeking pleasure. That if you can get by on eating bread crust and gruel, that ought to be all you aspire to. That you should not crave something grilled very carefully over temperature. You don't need that. And as an aesthetic, you would deny yourself that. Cynthia?
I think one aspect is that all material things are evil and only spiritual things are good.
And that's certainly, and that was a tenet that blossomed into Gnosticism. So much so that you could behave any way you wanted, so long as you were okay spiritually. That you're spiritual. You could engage in all kinds of idolatry and all kinds of self-gratification. So long as your spirit was pure, you'd be okay. You'd be acceptable. And that's kind of an outshoot of the fact that the material things can only be so good, and so they don't count. They don't matter. But what really matters is the spiritual thing, and that's part of Gnosticism. That's part of what's beginning to grow in this part of the world, at this particular part and time in history. But there's also an unnatural asceticism. It says not only have you done that simplifying, you're denying yourself pleasures, you cause yourself pain as discipline. You beat yourself, or you walk in uncomfortable shoes, or you wear scratchy clothes, or you shave your head all the time, because that indicates your inner purity. That indicates that you're really spiritually minded, because you're not only gone past simplifying, but now you're pushing into, I'm disadvantaging myself for my spirituality. And that aestheticism had particularly the Jewish people were pushing that, is saying that it's good for you to do things that you don't like, because the more you don't like them, the better you are. That's the kind of mentality, the kind of thing that they were pushing. Saw several hands here. I'll start with Chris. Perhaps, and that takes a lot of different. And to say that nothing matters that happens in the physical realm that impacts the spiritual realm is probably a stretch, because we're amphibious. God made us in His image both ways. He created us to live in this environment, and you can't completely divorce and separate those. And say I'm so disconnected from my body, I can do anything I want with it because my spirit's pure. There's just no basis for that. Tom?
Well, I was just going to make the point that it is a combination of what scholars have referred to as the Colossian heresy, and so it was actually kind of a melding of Jewish practices with Greek philosophy, and the development, and you touched on this, there were actually two schools of thought among the Greek philosophers. There were the Stoics and the Epicureans, the Stoics were more of the ascetic type, who would actually, the body is so, physical things are so evil, that you have to beat yourself so that you don't have any kind of desire for anything physical. Whereas on the other hand, the Epicureans, as you pointed out, were the ones who said the body's so evil, let's just indulge it. And so
Certainly.
you had these two schools of thought, and apparently what was happening in Colossae is the winning philosophy was the one where you just treat your body severely, and as Paul points out, it's kind of like, well, to me, it's like what you see in Matthew chapter 5, where Jesus talks about, if your right hand offends you, cut it off. Okay, well, that doesn't mean that you're still not going to be able to steal with your left hand. So it's more of a heart issue than it is
Certainly. This again is these two. I think again, if I can, a little bit more of a dogleg. Think about the impact. Think about how you would evaluate Jesus Christ given these two divergent viewpoints. Okay, what if you start drawing the logical conclusion? If all matter is corrupt and doesn't matter, then was Jesus really a man? And if Jesus was really a man, then we get into all kinds of, Christianity gets into trouble. What does the resurrection mean if he's not really a man? And does that mean that he wasn't God? Well, how could he be? He was a man for a little while, but that you start postulating these things, that God could have just invaded him at the last minute, just before he took his last breath, and he would have died for our sins. So technically, right? And this is the kind of crazy kind of thoughts that were coming up that basically that challenged Jesus' identity as a human. And on the other hand, would then, as a result of, well, if he's human, then there's nothing good in matter. There's nothing good in, he couldn't have been the Son of God. And so both of those elements are being challenged here, and Paul were right to address those. Fred?
I was just thinking that perhaps unless Jesus were fully human, he could not be the perfect sacrifice. He was always
Again,
just as always without sin. He was the perfect sacrifice.
the baggage, when you start taking things away from what the scriptures teach us about Jesus, that creates a lot of baggage and problems. And it said the ramifications of that, you start following that out, that there is no resurrection, as Paul does in 1 Corinthians 15. Well, if there's really no resurrection, then what does that say about us? We're a bunch of liars going around teaching people to believe something that's not true, in the hopes of that they'll be raised. If there's no resurrection, well, there's no resurrection. We're all foolish and are wasting our time. Not only wasting our time, but we're deluded too. And so that the ramifications of that, when you start tracing that out, get to be kind of large, and that's part of what Paul's going to do here. All these various influences, and the fact that Colossae is at this crossroads, is both culturally as well as physically, the crossroads of these two trade routes, as well as being on the river. And there was even a cult of angel worship that came up there. As a matter of fact, the legend has it that Colossae was saved by an angel, because some of the pagans wanted to displace the people that live in Colossae, so they changed the direction of the river. They dammed it up at the low points, and when the mountain melt-off came down, and they changed the route of the river, it would come down and flood. But this angel intervened and made a big gash in the earth, and the water flowed under the city. And in fact, it did. There was an underground river. It was a feature of the city. Not only was it on the river, but a portion of it disappeared north of Colossae and emerged south of Colossae. Of course, that probably didn't help them when the big earthquake came. And may have been a reason why there was so much devastation here and it wasn't rebuilt. Is that, it's kind of like, the wisdom about rebuilding New Orleans, a city that's already below sea level in a place that's, at ground zero in hurricane season. The idea about rebuilding it probably doesn't seem to be very wise. And so a lot of that thinking may have emerged when Colossae was impacted. But you've got all these different things that are coming together into kind of a perfect storm, or the reasons why I think that the stage is set for this letter to be written, and why Paul penned it. I also think that Epaphras probably visited Paul and brought him firsthand information. It may be that Epaphras was the evangelist there. It may be, and common thinking is that Epaphras was the one who founded the church. Now, there's a speculation as to how it was that Epaphras would have founded that church. But I'll remind you that in the book of Acts, that while Paul was spending his time in Ephesus, 3 years as I recall, that it's said that the whole of Asia heard the gospel. Now, that didn't mean that Paul whispered and told it firsthand to every single one. But Paul taught, the model in 2 Timothy 2, where you teach faithful men, who will be able to teach faithful men how to be faithful, who then will what? Teach other men how to be faithful. That model, I think, was deployed here, and that was probably the establishment of the church in these towns, in Laodicea and this central part of Asia, Laodicea, and Sardis for that matter. That all of Asia heard the gospel because of this iterative process, of this stage process of faithful men being taught, and then them taking it back to where they came from and telling others about it. Also, Ephesus. 3 years at Ephesus. In first of all, the synagogue, and then in a school, having access to people coming into town for their business and having the occasion of hearing the gospel and be converted. Well, then eventually they're going to go back home, and they're probably, as intended, going to take the gospel with them. That's part of the way that the system was supposed to operate. And so this church would probably, if it was established by Epaphras, it nonetheless may have felt some kinship or felt some authority. Epaphras probably did. In fact, that's the scenario that played out to Paul. And when confronted with these heresies, and in the absence perhaps getting any other influence or having another avenue in which that he could proceed, he, I think, visited Paul in prison. And that Paul revealed to them the things that he would need to know so that he could take this letter back and not only reinforce with the letter that was supposed to be circulated at least to Laodicea and probably the other churches in Asia, but not only with the letter, but also his firsthand experience and learning from Paul, that he would be able to reinforce this and underscore this message that Jesus is all you need. Jesus is all in all because he's all you need. And that's going to be the point of emphasis. That's going to be the thing that Paul's looking to displace any thought that contradicts that. He's going to lay a lot of important groundwork. And then we're going to discover some things that are said about Jesus that are, at least some of those things aren't said very many other places in the New Testament other than here and in this particular context. And the Spirit doesn't have to put it on every page because he put it here. He intended for us to study the book of Colossians in a manner like this so that we would understand these things about Jesus. Eric.
To build on that, I think, so we could rightly call this the letter of the Laodiceans.
Or the letter of the Asians.
Idea that be careful because Jesus is sufficient, and you are listening to philosophy, you are listening to message from people, take away from that message. That's the way I was being taught. They felt sufficient in and of themselves. So unfortunately, not helpful.
The Laodiceans are kind of interesting because we think about they're being chastised in the book of Revelation. They being chastised for being lukewarm. And the lukewarm water, I actually stumbled across this, and it's, again, maybe the sense of Wikipedia. But it actually said that because of some of the influence of warm springs in the area, as well as the proximity of the river, that the water, in fact, there was some places where you could go and the water was already heated up. It was already lukewarm. It was a characteristic and was, in fact, used in this wool and dye manufacturing process, that it saved you the step of having to heat the water to room temperature. And so the lukewarm waters of Laodicea may have in fact been a geographical comment. And so the play on words about I wish, I'm sorry that you're so lukewarm may have been something of a pun, maybe. And again, it's second, third, fourth degrees removed. Todd? This is really is an intro at this point.
So when you think about what the Jewish problem was, they wanted Jesus and legalism instead of doing it. The Greeks wanted Jesus and philosophy. Well, how about us today? You can look at the church Christians want Jesus and all kinds of social causes, and some want Jesus and my personal rights and liberties. Where are we? And that's the important thing. Is there something in our life that we're putting at the forefront more than what Jesus is asking?
I think what Paul wants to do here, and again, this goes back to the thesis, he wants you to have your life focused to abound and be rooted in Jesus. And if you're thinking about what I really need to go with my Jesus is some personal liberties, that you're thinking wrong. That what you need is Jesus. You don't need Jesus in social causes. You don't need Jesus in political reform. You don't need Jesus in tax reform. You don't need Jesus in stimulus, financial stimulus. What you need is Jesus. Jesus is the answer to your spiritual problems. And that you ought to, having embraced that, everything else in your life would be related to that revelation. That all the other decisions you would make would be based around the fact that you already made that decision. And the Jewish people said, yeah, you can practice some of that Christianity and this stuff so long as you remember the Sabbath and don't eat any impure food. And if you do that, you're just wasting your time with Christianity. But you need Jesus and some of this Judaism to be pleasing to God. And the Greeks are saying, no, Jesus, because you worship Jesus, doesn't mean you can't worship Artemis. You can also worship Zeus. You can worship Zeus and Artemis and in Jesus too. That was kind of their message, and the fact that the Jews had competition about monotheism. Yeah, that was one of the things most of the Romans didn't differentiate between the Jews and the Christians because they were both crazy and only worshipped one God. That was just one the Christians were just one fringe group of the Jews who had this completely whacked out notion that there was only one God. That was unique in the New Testament world. Now, most of us, I think, embrace that. The world doesn't, but I think most of us in this building probably don't need to be convinced that there's not a pantheon of multiple deities that we have to worship. But in fact, that was a novel idea in the first century, and that's one that Paul's reinforcing, that your focus is upon Jesus Christ as the Son of God, and that's it. There's nothing else required. And anyone that wants you to sell you something else, you just put your hand on your wallet and back away slowly. That's the kind of idea that I think that he's wanting us to embrace. Chris?
Okay, so let's not forget, you brought all these examples, let's not forget all the so-called vaccines. Focus on Jesus, not what the so-called vaccine. Bring it up.
Well, the focus is on, in terms of your spiritual state, vaccinated or unvaccinated, I don't know is an indication of your spiritual state. I don't think that's something that you're going to pursue that doesn't have it has potentially a spiritual component in that your attitudes toward others and how you behave, pro or con, is an indication of the assessment that you made internally. Are you in fact serving Jesus? Are you asking, what would Jesus do? What would Jesus want me to do? In being rooted and overflowing with Jesus Christ, if that's the thing that permeates my life, that touches everything in my life, then what should I do as a consequence of that? Jerry?
I keep thinking about what Paul said, I know nothing about you except Christ and him crucified. So I know you probably knew the names of a few people, but after Christ and him crucified, what else?
Well, he may have had conversations about the Roman government, or about his growing up Jewish, or about the places that he's visited. He may have had those conversations over dinner, or, in frequency, but he said, insofar as my teaching, what was my teaching about? I knew nothing among you, but the only person that I talked about, the only thing that I talked about was Jesus Christ and the power and the gospel and the power of God unto salvation. That's what I taught you. Everything I taught you was removed from that by 0 degrees. That is, it was directly about that or in direct support of that. And that's the thing that also reflects, I think, this attitude that Paul's calling attention to, and wants the Colossians to embrace as well. He doesn't want them to backtrack, obviously. He doesn't want them to mix something else in with their Christianity. He wants to call them true to Christianity. He's going to defend the sufficiency of Jesus Christ and the basis for that belief in the book. But it's to the end that the Colossians would be comforted in that they would be built up and they would be able to convince others of that, and that they themselves would be true, and would in fact be rooted and overflowing with gratitude, rooted, embraced, that they would achieve this, the means of the book, not just the people at this city, but the people in Asia, and the people in this city who knew those people. And so anything that you're worshiping, whether it's the government or the military or your ability to defend yourself or technology or whatever it is, anything that you're putting in the place that impacts your attitude toward Jesus Christ as being all sufficient. Now, Jesus Christ is not going to pass your calculus test. Jesus Christ is not going to keep your car running. That's not that kind of sufficiency. It's a sufficiency of, and when you realize, when you strip all these other concerns out of the way, and I'm left with my standing before my God in a righteous state or unrighteous state, there's nothing but Jesus. It doesn't matter if you use 20W30. It doesn't matter if your energy comes from green nuclear power. That doesn't matter. But when it comes down to your spiritual condition, the only measure is Jesus Christ. The only thing that does matter. And that's what Paul's going to emphasize here. And there's all kinds of idolatry. As in many places in the New Testament world that Paul visited, idolatry is among the rank and file. The majority of the people in the citizenry of the Roman people were raging idolists and proud of it. We somehow think of that. We somehow, we think, well, Paul's writing to a bunch of people who live like we do here in North America, where almost everybody at least professes to be a Christian. And it wasn't that way. It was not that way in the New Testament world. And Colossae is a fine example of that. And it is an example that many of the questions, and particularly the questions on page 8, are about the various heresies that came up that were mentioned in the book. And there were people from Phrygia that came down with their heresies. And the colorful description of this guy and his two disciples, two women disciples that crawled about the area with their poisonous. Let me just read it. Let me give it the full measure. The enemies. This is Montan in the middle of page 5. Montanus and his two chief women followers, Maximilia and Priscilla, as enemies of the church of God, haters of good and lovers of evil, and poisonous reptiles who crawled all over Asia and Phrygia. I like that description. Those are not terms of endearment. That was not meant as a compliment. That this was the kind of heresies. This is the kind of beliefs that would be that these people would be exposed to, and that they would need to defend their hearts from and be able to explain to others why they didn't believe those things, why they didn't pursue those, and instead pursue Jesus Christ. That's in fact what the book's written for. Question number 8 that was asked here again on page 8. What was so appealing about the Greeks' philosophies? We may read it and say, why would anybody believe that? But what was so appealing about it? Eric? Sure. And the fact that just when things were getting kind of old and stale, something new came along. And to the Greeks, you could subscribe to something new. If your asceticism says that, you were getting kind of tired of that, something new could come along and you could embrace that. You didn't necessarily have to give up the asceticism. And it was very much cafeteria style. They allowed a lot of freedom of thought, freedom of belief. You could mix and match as you wanted. And the fact that something new is coming up all the time was actually some of the novelty of it. Many of them also, basically, the philosophies were such that if your mind's right, it doesn't matter what you do. And boy, ain't that a good system. What's not to like about that? You mean I can eat whatever I want, I can do whatever I want, I can visit whatever temple harlots that I want, and it doesn't impact my spirituality? I'm still okay with God? Sure. And and I said, we didn't invent that. That's not a 20th century thing. That's older. That's really older than the Greeks. The Greeks loved it. They loved distilling it down and said, well, everywhere you look around it, matter is corrupting. It's falling apart. It's corrupted by its own nature. It's the way it's even created. It was flawed. So why even focus on the matter? Doesn't matter. What a slogan, right? The matter doesn't matter. And what's not to like about that? Because the closer it gets as human beings, and I'll get to Aaron's comment and Cynthia's next. The closer, whether we like it or not, this is one of the ugly parts of human beings. And our hearts, what we really would like is for someone in authority to come and tell us, do what you want. It's okay. That's what we really long to hear. Not, I love you, or I need you, or you're important to me. What we really want to hear, what really scratches that itch is, go ahead and do what you want. It's all right. That's the human condition. That's really selfish. That's really turned in and left our own devices, left without any energy pushing us one way or the other. That's the direction that we drift, is doing what we like. It's the human condition. That's life under the sun. That's the way things work here. That's the way that these systems work on that, and they prey on that. They need those engines need that to run. Aaron?
Our brains, we still are horrible people, right? So I fully deserve the punishment I give myself. That's part of it. It's an excuse to hurt.
Sure.
Number two, it's an outward declaration that I'm spiritual. I'm faithful. Look at my bruises. I'm strong, right? And really, we're just lying to ourselves that that's the path we take, or at least in this case, they were. It was an excuse to hurt yourself, and also to hopefully convince yourself that I'm worthy of this God that I serve.
And it's hard to think how much do you have to think, how twisted do you have to be to come around to that? But it's not that hard. It's the truth of the matter. We can, as a rational being, we can rationalize a lot of stuff and arrive exactly at the point that you're talking about, saying that somehow this bad thing, this pain, is actually an indication that I'm a good person. Cynthia? You keep till next week. I came with the intention that if you didn't have very much to say, or if I could curb my rapid pass, that we might actually get in to start looking at the very first lesson. But the first lesson starts with chapter 1. We'll begin there next week. I think that we've covered all of the questions. There was a question number 5 that talked about how quickly the church is in this area. There's evidence that, well, this is 60 A.D. Paul was in Corinth around 52 A.D. So it's not very long. He was in Ephesus a little bit after that, say in the mid-century, the mid-50s in Ephesus, when this church when Epaphras probably received the teaching that established this church. So it's not been very long before these heresies came along, because they were already there. They were already entrenched. They were being refined, and there were some new wrinkles on them, but the idolatry and heresies were already in this part of the world when Christianity arrived. So Christianity would have to displace it among its believers, and that's part of the mission that Paul's trying to fulfill. Next week. Thank you.